Thank you, Bobby, for that kind introduction. I get to be the preacher that follows Adam Rippon at the conference. As Bobby mentioned in the introduction, I live all the way across the country in the other Washington, D.C. And I gotta say, with all that's going on there right now, I am really grateful to be here with all of you in this Washington. These are trying times for our nation, times that demand our strength and our resilience. And one of the ways we build resilience is by being together with our people, our LGBTQ family, our allies, colleagues who believe in diversity and inclusion and belonging at a time when we can't take those values for granted. So I just want to say at the end of this great opening ceremony, it is good to be together. But I got to say, it's also a little intimidating for me to be here. Over the summer, out in Equal's awesome COO, Rachel Rubin, was kind enough to reach out to me and talk me through this morning and the program. And at one point, she stopped the conversation. She said, "Reverend Hardies, you know, before the conference, we should probably talk about the religion thing, right? I want you to know," she said, "you will be the first religious leader to address our conference ever," right? And I guess that doesn't really surprise me. I've stood at this intersection between the LGBTQ community and the faith community for long enough to know what Rachel was getting at. I know that for some of us, our faith, whatever our tradition is a source of great sustenance and strength in our lives. And I know that for far too many of us, the faith community has been a source of oppression, exclusion, and even violence. And while many faith communities have made progress toward LGBT inclusion, many more still have a long way to go. So I really appreciate the risk that Aaron and Rachel and others took inviting me to be here today. And my hope is that if we can stand together for a moment at the sometimes uncomfortable intersection between religion and queerness, we might learn something about what it means to belong. Can I share the story about the first time I came out as a religious leader in the gay community? Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. It was back in the mid-90s, and I was young and just getting started in seminary in Berkeley, California. And one night I went to the local gay bar, the White Horse. Anyone know the White Horse? And yeah, all right, I thought so. And I'm at the bar, and a handsome guy comes up next to me. He starts a conversation. He buys me a drink, and he leans over and he says, "So, what do you do?" And I'm kind of into him. I'm also really excited about my new career, and so I just blurt out, "I'm studying to be a pastor." End of conversation. At least he let me keep the drink. That encounter, and others like it early on, left me wondering, having struggled for so long to come out as gay, was I now going to have to go back into the closet as a gay person of faith? I know that many of us have identities that sometimes leave us feeling on the margins of our own community. Like maybe we don't belong. And after nearly 20 years in the ministry, I've learned that one thing that we human beings need most is to be accepted and welcomed and valued for all of who we are, in all our glorious complexity and contradiction, with all our intersecting identities. We long to belong. Now, as advocates for equality and inclusion, you know this, of course. This is what you do. You create professional spaces where people can show up as their full selves. It's not always easy work, but it's important work that speaks to a powerful human need. And so I want to stand before you today and thank you for the work that you do. It's important work. Because I got to tell you, I wish there'd been a diversity and inclusion officer around when I was coming up in the church. When I was young, I was really active in my congregation. I led the youth group and I sang in the choir. But when I got to high school, our church had a horrible fight and eventually split because a lesbian wanted to teach Sunday school. I was still in the closet at the time, even to myself, but the hateful things said about gay people during that fight drove me even deeper into the closet and drove me away from God. So that by the time I graduated from college, I was an out and proud gay man, and I was an even outer and prouder atheist. I didn't want to have anything to do with religion. Yet by some strange turn of the karmic wheel, my first job out of college was with Habitat for Humanity. You know, that's the Christian home building ministry that Jimmy Carter works with. I worked for Habitat just down the road from here in Portland, Oregon. I signed up thinking that I'd be swinging a hammer and building homes, but someone at Habitat decided it'd be a good idea to put the gay atheist in charge of church outreach. My job was literally to go around Portland and recruit churches and synagogues to build homes with Habitat. Problem was, many of the churches that I tried to recruit that year were caught up in that season in a horrible anti-gay referendum on the Oregon state ballot. Now, it's easy to forget that 25 years ago, Portland wasn't the progressive utopia that we now might imagine it to be. This was way pre-Portlandia, okay? Back then, the religious right was filling our radios and television sets with messages about how gay people were pedophiles and sinners. And I had to sit down and talk with some of the very churches that paid for those ads. But one Sunday, I was assigned to recruit a different kind of church. It was the First Unitarian Church of Portland. And I'd always heard that, that the Unitarians were progressive and open-minded people, but I wasn't prepared for what I encountered that day. You see, during that year's gay rights battle, folks could signal their solidarity with the gay community by hanging a pink ribbon on their front door or placing a sign in their window that said hate-free zone. Well, when I showed up that first morning at the Unitarian Church, I discovered that they'd taken their entire downtown city block, the buildings, the trees, the streetlights, everything, and wrapped it all up in bright pink ribbons. Hate-free zone signs were affixed to every possible surface. It was overwhelming. Frankly, it was a little over the top. But you know what I learned? I learned that when we're trying to let people know that they belong, after centuries of exclusion, then sometimes our welcome needs to be extravagant. Right? I walked into the church that Sunday and heard a powerful sermon on gay rights given by a woman preacher. And then a young man from the choir got up to the pulpit carrying a baby in his arms. And he said that when he and his partner adopted their son, the church choir threw them a baby shower. This was 1994, the first time I'd ever seen an out gay person speak in a church. Now, you need to know that throughout that entire service, I was sitting in the way far back corner of the church, and I was ugly crying, okay? It was really messy. People kept, passing Kleenex back to me. But it was the first time since coming out that I'd felt at home in a religious community. The first time I felt welcome again in the presence of God. And thanks to that young gay father, it's the first time I allowed myself to imagine that maybe I could be a father one day after all. So that's just a bit of a journey that brought me to where I am today, serving a church in Washington, D.C. that is filled with people of many different races and cultures and creeds, people of different abilities and sexual orientations and gender expressions. The church is called All Souls. And I know I'm biased, but I happen to think that's a really great name for a church. I mean, can you imagine a church that calls itself Some Souls? On the other hand, All Souls sets a pretty high bar for our diversity and inclusion work, doesn't it? Because All Souls means everybody. And just like many of your organizations, I'm sure, our church sometimes falls short of that lofty goal. And when we do fall short, it can be a powerful thing to acknowledge that. I remember in high school I had a friend whose uncle, a gay man, was dying from HIV-related causes. This was back in the early days of the epidemic. My friend was from a large, extended Catholic family, and as his uncle lay dying, the family reached out to the church to see if a priest would come and administer last rites at the bedside. Several priests turned them down. But finally, one priest did come to the family's home and said the ritual blessing for the dying. And when he was done with the prayer, with the whole family gathered around the bed, the priest got down on his knees and apologized to the dying man for how he'd been treated by his church and begged the man's forgiveness. Heartfelt apologies, extravagant welcomes. In the church, this is how we're finally trying to move forward the work of inclusion. One final story, if I may. Not long ago, I returned to Portland, Oregon, to spend a summer there with my husband and our young son. Soon after we arrived, though, a terrorist shot up the gay nightclub in Orlando, the Pulse. killing 49 people and wounding many others. We all remember that awful night. It's hard to be away from home when a tragedy like that occurs, right? Because your instinct is to want to be with your people, with your friends and loved ones. But there we were 3,000 miles away from our friends and family. We didn't know where to go or what to do. The day after the shooting, though, I saw a poster announcing a great impromptu dance party that very night, organized by a black queer collective of DJs in Portland in response to the Orlando shooting. And my husband and I said, well, that's obviously where we need to be. And so we found a sitter for our son, and that night we crowded into a jam-packed Portland dance club, and it was a beautiful sight, friends. There were queer folks and straight folks, white folks and people of color. There were some fierce drag queens. There were sequins and leather and ripped denim. There were butch women and effeminate men. There were feminine women and butch men. There were lots of people, including gender, queer, and trans folks for whom those binaries made no difference whatsoever. And no one was policing which bathroom anyone was going to. That night, in spite of all the violence and hate swirling around, we were all safe, and we belonged. All of us. And when the music started to build, we all gathered on the dance floor, and with each beat, we jumped and throbbed together like our bodies were one body, like our hearts were one with the music and with each other. And looking across the room, I could see all our faces lit up by the flashing strobe, radiant faces, kissing faces, faces of many colors, pierced and tattooed faces, faces with handlebar mustaches, this being Portland after all. And I looked around at all that beauty, and I thought to myself, I'm 3,000 miles away from home, but I found my people. I belong here tonight among my vulnerable, resilient, absolutely fabulous family. Friends, we live in difficult and, yes, dangerous times. Let's keep showing up for one another, whether in the workplace or on the dance floor, whether in a house of worship or at the ballot box or marching in the streets together. Let's show up for one another saying, you, we belong. Thank you.